І зараз я запрошую до слова Рефата Чубарова, голову Меджлісу кримсько-татарського народу, який, незважаючи на перепони...
Refat Chubarov is head of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar, who, in spite of hindrances on the way, on the part of Russian authorities, he spoke on the 22nd, 23rd.
Invite Refat Chubarov, head of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people. Mr. Chubarov will brief us, will debrief on his on the results of the first international conference that has taken place in New York on the 22-23 this month. Прошу вас.
Good afternoon, everybody. And the topic of my appearance here is the results of the first international conference on the issues of indigenous people. I'll remind us all that due to decades of efforts on the part of representatives of indigenous people, in 2007 the UN managed to adopt a declaration on the rights of indigenous people. Crimean Tatars are an indigenous nation of Ukraine. They are one of components, although maybe a small one, of the great family of indigenous people that is composed of almost 300 million people in the world. In 2007, when the UN has approved this declaration, regrettably, our state then abstained from joining this declaration. Of course, the times were different, but one of the motives of non-aligning to this declaration was the problem of Crimean Tatars, and there were apprehensions in the Ukrainian politicum at the moment, but of course, after the occupation and then the annexation of Crimea, this Ukraine's parliament has adopted a resolution with the declaration that they joined this declaration. On the 22nd and 23rd of September in New York, there was the first World Conference on the Rights of Indigenous People, and they had the aim to adopt a document of the UN General Assembly that provides for some mechanisms that have to help realize this declaration. As you understand, many international standards in the sphere of human rights and people's rights are being approved by the UN in the form of declaration, and the main thing after the adoption, but of course the adoption itself is a very complicated problem that means the agreement between interests of a lot of countries, members of the UN. But after the adoption of this or that international declaration, it is very important to create mechanisms to implement those declarations and control the way when all the countries that join declarations do stick to them, do adhere to them. So in this document, while it was being prepared, there are moments that testify to the fact that within the United Nations there will be special mechanisms created that will monitor the implementation and fulfillment of the rights of indigenous people by governments of different countries, and they will also help in observance of the rights of indigenous people. I had an opportunity to speak during the discussion of those issues, but before that, I want to once more draw your attention to the fact that prior to the opening of this international conference, the Russian official representation office at the United Nations objected against the participation and speech of representatives of Crimean Tatar people's Mejlis. I don't have the official text, which they several times sent to the UN General Secretary and the staff of the UN, but as Ukrainian diplomats told me, the Russian side proceeded from the notion that any problem that pertains to Crimean Tatars is now the problem that relates only to the Russian Federation, and that's why only them have the right to voice any proposals. I want to thank here both the Ukrainian representation delegation to the United Nations and many colleagues of the Ukrainian diplomats who have not accepted this Russian objection, and they founded their reaction on the fact that almost all the members of the UN, except some countries, have not recognized the annexation of Crimea, and they condemned this annexation. And it is rather logical that Russian objection was repelled, was thrown out. I just want to emphasize one thing in my speech. The delegation of the Crimean Tatar people, while having supported all the measures provided for by this final document, in particular the creation of the position of a special delegate of the UN on indigenous people, we still think that this creation of this office does require some time, but the situation in Crimea is so dangerous and threatening that we cannot lose even a day. So in my speech and in other forms of our activity at the session of the General Assembly, we talked to our partners about the need to urgently create a special mission of the UN, having solved the issues, legal and organizational issues of this mission's presence in Crimea. This is very important, and you are witnesses to this. The information that we receive from Crimea, from people who live there, from journalists and human rights activists, and not only Crimean Tatars, but from different parts of the Crimean society, and the information that we get from the occupation authorities are very different. And this is very important here, that the international community, and in particular the UN, in their decisions and their assessments about Crimea, proceed from, let's say, from what is witnessed with eyes of their missionaries or representatives of the mission that we think should be there, sent by the United Nations. For us, Crimean Tatars, and especially against the background of recent events on the eve of the so-called elections that took place on the 15th of September, and especially after those elections, against the background of large-scale repressive measures against Crimean Tatars, for us, the presence of this mission would be very important. This is probably the issue of safety of Crimean Tatars, of the Crimean Tatar people, but not only of them. And we will continue our efforts, and we will insist in two organizations that have respective mandates about the observance of the rights of human rights and rights of peoples in order to avoid large-scale disasters, the United Nations and the OSCE. From our point of view, in spite of a very complicated way to solve legal issues connected to the status of Crimea and the presence of representatives of international organizations, still we have to find in international law such arguments and opportunities so that in the nearest future such a mission is present in Crimea. There is a lot of apprehensions about a further development of situation in Crimea. I don't want to again cite many disastrous forecasts about possible deportation, but today the situation is rather well formed, and we see there is a large-scale and systemic repressions of the occupation authorities to push people out of Crimea to the maximum. The position of Crimean Tatars and our desire is to live on our land, notwithstanding any conditions, but while we preserve our human dignity, our national dignity, and our religious dignity. So I'm here in front of you. Your questions, please.
Thank you. We have questions. Good afternoon. Image Ukraine. Does official Kiev give you sufficient assistance, material assistance, information assistance? Our country, is in a very complicated situation. I would like to say that all the activities of the Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people, just like in the previous years, before the aggression, before the occupation that was held, and today this activity is taking place without any assistance of other sides, including our country. We are not insisting on such assistance. The main assistance for us now is that Ukrainian society, Crimean Tatars, and our country, we all together should be able to liberate Crimea and to so that the life is normal, and this will be the main assistance to us, to Crimean Tatars. TV channel Ukraine, setting up such a mission that you are talking about, it looks like this may take, if not years, then months. And we know that Russians are very actively blocking different international mechanisms. And in the result, this mission could be non-efficient. What do you believe? How quickly it could be organized, and what issues it will help address to Crimean Tatars? We all these days and weeks when that were the saddest times in Crimea. I was in Crimea then. It was the end of July and the beginning of March. Then every day we were calling upon international community to interfere to stop all these brutal actions that violate international law. But every time from different international institutions, including the special UN institutions, we heard that there are certain procedures, and these procedures do not allow them to do what we were calling upon. Like we were calling upon bringing peacekeeping forces to Crimea in the beginning of March, when there was the biggest threat for Crimea. But I would like to say that the further actions related to escalation of violence with the beginning of full-scale war against Russia on the territory of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, they forced international community to implement certain measures to stop violence. So you understand that there's certain contradiction to the practices of international organizations will interfere when the blood is shed and when there will be, I'm sorry, a lot of blood shed. So now we call upon to prevent such possible events in Crimea. Talking about the mission, we were there together with Mrs. Lutkovska at the meeting of the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva in the beginning of June, and we met different representatives of mission. The Russians were there as well, and when I came up with this proposal, the answer of Russian side was, we have no objections, but via Moscow, via the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia, they believe that this way, using these all procedures in the international community, they believe they will force international community to recognize this situation, which is unfair. And that is why we always say, if any country, any state, which is the UN member, can use the norms of procedure against the whole international community, then the international community has to change their norms and procedures. Another question? Voice of America Uzbek service. You've mentioned that there were repressions taking place in Crimea. There are searches in the houses of Mejlis activists, and it's strange that there's no statement made by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. There was no official statement made. How do you assess that? And the second question, how is the issue being resolved with your return to Crimea and the return of Mr. Dzhemilev? The Ministry of Foreign Affairs made a statement and comments. They were at different fora. It was on illegal confiscations, and there are still such cases taking place. It was about confiscating the office of Mejlis, and there were press briefings of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and they were making statements there as to other forms of repressions. You know, a few days ago, the two young Crimean Tatars were kidnapped just in the middle of the day. One is called Islam. He's 19, and Jevdet is 23. And the Ministry of Foreign Affairs also reacted with a statement. Another thing is, and such statements were made by some states, members of European Union, the Council of Europe, the leaders of some states made statements, and also certain international organizations. The leaders of European Union countries. But I would like to put it diplomatically. During the statements, where they are talking about all this permanent concern or deep concern, these statements, especially in Crimea, are perceived by people who wait for more efficient forms of human rights protection. They are perceived by people with some irritation. I'm sorry for this word. Basically, the lack of efficient form of protection kills any hope and people stop believing in the power of the international law. And we are trying to tell about that to our international partners so that the problem of the human rights protection in Crimea, the problem of Crimean Tatar people, should be taken up at a higher level so that it is a separate topic when considering different sanctions against Russia. Russian authorities have to clearly understand that any their actions against the citizens of Ukraine, against the citizens of Crimea, will have consequences, not just in the form of statements, but in the form of specific actions which will worsen the situation of Russian Federation. As to my situation and the situation of Mr. Dzhemilev, and he's, by the way, in Strasbourg, and he participates in the meeting of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. We work with the lawyers. His documents are in the European Court on Human Rights, and my documents will also be submitted to that court. We understand it clearly that for us these prohibitions are very painful, because that's violation of our own rights, the rights of people who work for us. But we also understand that the resolution of this issue of our return will also mean the resolution of all the problems related to the aggression of Russia against Ukraine and issues related to occupation of Crimea. Mr. Chubarov, what other forms of efficient protection can we talk besides stronger sanctions against Russian Federation? What should official Kiev do? What are other forms of efficient protection? We need efficient defense. We need to look at different spheres of activities related to the life of occupied part of Ukrainian territory, especially when it comes to economic relations. As an example, I would like to give you such a thing, that supply of any goods to the Crimea from the continental part of Ukraine. You remember a few weeks ago, about a month ago, the Rospotrebnadzor of Russia prohibited to import to Russia any goods from the territory of Ukraine. But then the so-called Crimean authorities requested Moscow to allow to bring food products to Crimea because they are facing some problems, and they received such a permit. If you go there now, if you go to this point where there's this so-called administrative border between the continental part and occupied territory, you will see hundreds of trucks there. And you will see some companies which are supplying food products. I would like to say, you maybe know, the permit to these companies is given by Crimean government. Do you think they do it free of charge? No, they do it for bribes. And these bribes are then put to the Crimean to Crimea, and from that they pay salaries to the illegal, according to Ukrainian legislation, self-defense units, and they are then basically used against Crimean Tatars. So all our spheres of activities related to Crimea are to be deeply analyzed, and if there are any issues which deteriorate the life of people, especially in the sphere of human rights, they are to be changed. And I believe that our government will work on that as well. A question. if, for example, the journalist from continental Ukraine comes to Crimea, what's the attitude to journalists there? How should journalists behave? I can tell you, but it's better to feel. If you remember Soviet times, just believe you are back to these times of Soviet times, the beginning of the 80s, when there was an aggression against Afghanistan, when the KGB was very active in this society. You will see that people will not be open to you. People will believe that they will be looking at what you are saying. If you say something they do not like, they will believe you are a provocateur. If you have friends and relatives and friends and people you know, it will be much easier. But you will not be able to express your viewpoint if it is different from the official one. If you say that, something which is different, you will be pushed away from Crimea, and they will prohibit for you to enter, as they believe, the territory of Russian Federation. Turkish Al Jazeera, I would like to ask such a question. Last week and a couple of weeks ago in Crimea, we saw some situations with Crimean Tatars. All these events, what meaning do they have? What do they mean? Do they want to liquidate Mejlis, or do they want to create the Mejlis which will be obeying? Then you are in Kiev, but Crimean Tatars are there. And besides, some other Crimean Tatar politicians are here on the continental part of Ukraine. How will it be possible in the future to have good relations and contacts with Crimean Tatars in Crimea? We see that there are some people who are more pro-Russian there. To put it briefly, the main objective of Crimean authorities, occupational authorities, is to take the situation in Crimea and the society in Crimea to the state similar to other Russian territories. If you know a little bit about the life in Russia, you will agree that in Voronezhskaya, Bryanskaya, Tulskaya regions, the interrelations between the authorities and the society, they are all according to one norm. When in the society there's practically no organized opposition, with the exception of one or two persons, and when any actions, any initiatives, any intentions of the authorities, the society has to either approve or support or praise. The Crimean society, even in the part which was welcoming accession to Russia, was used to different behavior. When there was the jurisdiction of Ukraine over Crimea, at that time, Aksionov and his guys could take Russian flags, go to the outside organized meetings, and they could talk openly about the problems of Crimea. They could openly talk against the Ukrainian authorities. They were behaving like the citizens in the state where the human rights were observed, at least in the form that they were able to demonstrate to demonstrate their rights. In Russia, that's perceived as a challenge to the whole state. There are just Crimean Tatars who, from the point of view of authorities, allow themselves to do something. They have their own elected authorities. They get together, they discuss things, but when they make decisions, they somehow are trying to implement these decisions. They demonstrate the unity around the decisions which are made. The new authorities in Crimea, they cannot stand it, because in that state this shouldn't exist. And that is why there is this whole system of oppression on all the representative bodies of Crimean Tatars, starting from Mejlis. The authorities are trying now to implement different things so that those who disagree are replaced by those who will always look at what the authorities want. But during the 23 years since we came back to Crimea, we survived that even under the jurisdiction of Ukrainian state, especially when Yanukovych was in power, when the whole power of the state was directed to destroy Mejlis and to bring other people. They failed to do that, and they will fail to do that. That's answer to your first question. And the second question, I forgot what was it about. You are here, and other Crimean Tatar leaders are here. What about the relations with the Crimean Tatars in Crimea? We managed to do that in different forms. Allow me not to tell which are these forms, but a few days ago we had another meeting of the Mejlis of Crimean Tatar people. I was doing that. I was leading there over Skype. My colleagues were in Simferopol. We discussed all the important issues, and we passed different decisions on them. In any case, we believe that the stability of Mejlis is related not to certain people, even if they are elected at high positions, but the stability of Mejlis is, the Mejlis is stable because all the bodies of Mejlis are elected by Crimean Tatars, the local, the regional, and Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people. And even if somehow some part, small part of members of Mejlis wants to change their behavior, their activity will be adjusted by the Crimean Tatar community on a specific territory. To put it honestly, I had different forms of interaction of those who, against our will, came to Crimea. And when some of them were saying, but how can you make Mejlis friendly? And I say, it's easy. Tell the Crimean Tatars that you came to execute all their legal rights, the Crimean Tatar autonomy, the rights of indigenous people, and then maybe you may count that there will be a basis for dialogue. What dialogue? And also the right to dispose of your own land. Who can come to this land without asking the indigenous people? And they did not like such advice, and we never had such a dialogue again. Once you have no more questions, I would like to thank Mr. Refat Chubarov. Thank you. And